Separating the holy from the profane. Let's look at Ezekiel 22:26, which reads, "Her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. They have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them." We are not told the specifics of how the Levitical priest had not distinguished between the holy and the profane in Ezekiel 22:26, but we can reasonably conclude two things. One, the first is that it involved a calendation issue because it resulted in the true Sabbaths being hidden from the eyes of God's people. Second, the second conclusion is that whatever the specifics were, it involved mixture of some type. The priests were in some way mixing the holy with the profane rather than distinguishing and separating between them, so that only the holy would be utilized and as a result the Sabbaths rightly observed. God is pure, according to Psalm 18:26, verse 26, and does not sanction the type of mixture that the priests were involved with. There are consequences for allowing mixture, not the least of which is having the true Sabbath hidden from us. Are the New Testament spiritual priests after the order of Melchizedek, parenthesis, pastors, teachers, commentators, etc., having the lunar Sabbath hidden from their eyes by not separating the holy, parenthesis, lunar solar calendar, from the profane, parenthesis, pagan solar-only Gregorian calendar, question mark. Why are the scriptures pointing out this specific transgression? We are told in 1 Corinthians 10:11, "Now all of these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." Why is this an important reminder? Perhaps because the same or very similar things that the Levitical priest did in Ezekiel is unwittingly being done today by God's people, both Jews and Gentiles. Someone may ask, how is that? The answer is by utilizing a solar-only calendar or a Gregorian calendar for determining their weekly Sabbaths, while using the lunar solar calendar for determining the annual Sabbaths. In other words, while feast keepers today look to a lunar solar calendar to determine the dates of the feast days they want to observe, they cling to the solar-only calendar for determining their weekly Sabbaths, i.e. Saturday or Sunday. Has this mixture we practice today also resulted in Yah allowing the biblical solar Sabbath being hidden from our eyes? It would seem so. Diving deeper into the dichotomy of two calendars. Dichotomy, the definition, is a division or difference between two different things or ideas that are opposed. The lunar solar and solar only are fundamentally two different calendars. A calendar that determines the weekly Sabbaths by the sun only versus a calendar that determines the weekly Sabbaths by both the sun and the moon are, by definition, two fundamentally different calendars and therefore cannot both be scriptural. A calendar that supports a continuous, unbroken chain of Saturday Sabbaths versus a calendar in which the monthly new moon intermission days reset the weekly Sabbaths are, by definition, two fundamentally different calendars. God is holy and does not mix the holy with the profane. The combining of God's holy, set-apart lunar-solar calendar, which we find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 through 16, with today's profane or common solar-only Gregorian calendar is not biblically kosher. One of the most obvious examples of this mixture can be found in Leviticus 23, where we see the first appointed times, or moed, listed is the weekly Sabbath in verses 1 through 3, which tradition teaches is determined by the sun only, continuously counting every 7 days, while all the other appointed times in Leviticus 23, or the annual Sabbaths, listed are determined by both the sun and the moon on a lunar-solar calendar. A calendar that combines solar-only weekly Sabbaths with a lunar-solar annual Sabbath is a mixture that Yahweh does not sanction. This mixture, in part, is a result of so many of God's people ignoring a very important verse, Psalm 104:19a, which says, He appointed the moon for seasons. The word seasons is Strong's 41450, which means moedim, or appointments. Today's Sabbatarians Saturday Sabbatarians think that all they need to do is look for Saturday on their solar-only Gregorian calendar, or count every 7 days by the sun's rising until the next Saturday arrives. By doing so, they ignore the moon's function, which Yah has ordained as a faithful witness to identify the weekly Sabbaths by the moon's phases. Scripture tells us that every matter must be established by 2 or 3 witnesses, Deuteronomy 19:15b and 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1b. What escapes the notice of most Saturday Sabbatarians is that utilizing only the sun in determining the weekly Sabbaths is only one witness and runs contrary to the principle of 2 or 3 witnesses needed to confirm a matter. Without 2 or 3 witnesses, a Saturday Sabbath is not scripturally established, regardless of what tradition teaches. The importance of understanding the term fixed as it relates to time. As we briefly considered earlier, the Oxford Dictionary defines the word fixed as fastened securely in position, especially of price, rate, or time, predetermined and not able to be changed. This is a universally accepted definition of the word fixed. As an example, my wife's birthday is January 10th. We were married on January 13th many years ago. Once we were married, the 4 days, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th, between her birthday and our anniversary was cast in concrete, as they say. Those 4 days became fixed, and they will never change. Regardless of which days of the week her birthday and our anniversary fall on from year to year, the 10th through the 13th remain fixed dates. I can never say to my wife, I'm changing your birthday from the 10th to the 12th because I didn't have time to get you a present. In like manner, once the resurrection took place, the number of days between the crucifixion and the resurrection also became fixed, never to change from 1 year to the next, regardless of the days of the week. Once a fixed number of days is established between the crucifixion and the resurrection, the date of the resurrection also becomes fixed, because it is forever anchored to the crucifixion on the 14th. It becomes fixed in terms of being 3 days by inclusive reckoning from the crucifixion, and it becomes fixed in terms of always falling on the 16th of Nisan. What always comes between the 14th and the 16th? Question mark. Yes, the weekly Sabbath. So whether you believe there are 3, 4, or 5 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection, those number of days or dates are a fixed number, never to change from year to year. The only way to have a fixed number of days between the crucifixion and resurrection is to count from the new moon every year. This demonstrates that since the crucifixion on the 14th is a fixed date, then the resurrection 3 days later must also be a fixed date, which is the 16th. If the first day of the week, or the resurrection day on the 16th, is fixed, then the 7th-day weekly Sabbath, which immediately precedes it, must also be fixed. They are all tethered together. You cannot have a weekly Sabbath that keeps changing dates between 2 fixed dates, the 14th and the 16th during Passover. The only way to have a weekly Sabbath fall on the 15th of Nisan every year is on a lunar-solar calendar. On a lunar-solar calendar, all mid-month weekly Sabbaths fall on the 15th, which harmonizes with all of the scriptures which depict the weekly Sabbaths as falling on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. Another way to think about this is that the first day of the week always follows the 7th-day Sabbath. They are always consecutive. In other words, whatever number of days one believes that there are from the crucifixion to the resurrection, they must always include a weekly Sabbath and the first day of the week, since Yeshua was raised on the first day according to the Scriptures, and the Scriptures cannot be broken. The crucifixion took place on the 14th, and unleavened bread took place on the 15th. Both the 14th and the 15th are fixed and cannot change. If there are a fixed number of days, i.e. 3 days in this example, between crucifixion and resurrection, and the resurrection took place on the first day or the 16th of the week, immediately after the weekly Sabbath, then the weekly Sabbath must have been on the 15th, and continues to be every Sabbath, every month, every year. You cannot have a fixed date for the crucifixion and a fixed number of days between the crucifixion and a weekly Sabbath that changes dates every month and every year. In other words, how can Saturday Sabbatarians celebrate the 14th, 15th, and 16th, which is the crucifixion, the weekly Sabbath, and the resurrection, respectively, 1 year, because it falls on a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then ignore the 14th, 15th, and 16th the following year if those dates fall on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, simply because those dates don't include what they consider to be a weekly Sabbath. Weekly Sabbaths are fixed and do not change. Only a fixed weekly Sabbath, the 15th, makes all scriptures harmonize. This is what the scriptures teach. We're going to talk next about day-specific Sabbaths or date-specific Sabbaths. What is meant by day-specific versus date-specific? Most holidays like July 4th are date-specific, meaning that they always take place on the same date, regardless of the day of the week they fall on. Some holidays, however, are day-specific and always follow on the same day of the week, like Memorial Day, which always falls on the last Monday in May, regardless of the date. The Gregorian calendar is both day-specific and date-specific. Saturday Sabbaths are day-specific rather than date-specific because the dates on which they fall are always changing. This alone shows Saturday Sabbaths to be unbiblical. The biblical weekly Sabbaths are always date-specific, never day-specific. The Lunar-Solar Sabbaths are fixed and never change dates. Lunar-Solar Sabbaths are date-specific and always fall on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. This can be demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt through numerous scriptures for those willing to be Bereans and search the scriptures. Every date identifiable weekly Sabbath in Scripture always falls on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th without exception. But there is not one Scripture that shows Saturday to be the weekly Sabbath. There is not one Scripture that shows that biblical weeks or weekly Sabbaths are in a continuous, unbroken chain without new moon intermissions. Once Yah lays a calendar foundation, it never changes. The lunar-solar calendar foundation is established in Genesis, which has been built upon and confirmed throughout the Scriptures. It has never changed. On the other hand, it is universally and historically acknowledged that today's solar-only Gregorian calendar was not in existence when the heavens and the earth were created in Genesis. Hence, it cannot be the foundational calendar of Scriptures which the weekly seventh-day Sabbaths, upon which the weekly seventh-day Sabbaths are determined. Today's Gregorian calendar is not a reflection of what has always been. Here are a few historical highlights that expose the unbiblical nature of the solar-only Gregorian calendar. First, the lunar or the moon component was removed by Emperor Julius Caesar in 46 BCE in favor of a solar-only calendar. 2. The resultant 8-day Julian calendar started evolving into a 7-day week planetary calendar toward the beginning of the 2nd century, at which time Saturday named after the Roman god and planet Saturn, was being observed by many as the first day of the week, with Friday as the seventh day of the week. And here's a graphic that is a stick calendar that was actually discovered in the Roman baths toward the end of the first century. And it shows there that Saturday is in the left position of 7 planetary gods in a row. And so that is showing Saturday as the first day of the week on this calendar. It was only later that Saturday was repositioned to the 7th day of the week and was officially adopted by Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in 321 CE. And 3, because of the continuing calendar errors, it became necessary to remove 10 days in 1582 by Pope Gregory, from which we derive the current Gregorian calendar. Hardly sounds like the unalterable, unchanging Genesis calendar, does it? Only the lunar-solar calendar of Genesis chapter 1 is the foundational calendar by which the seventh-day Sabbaths are determined. The unscriptural foundation of a solar-only calendar is faulty at its core and must be rejected for determining seventh-day Sabbaths. Solar-only Sabbaths lack a biblical foundation. And here's a picture for those that are able to see the screen of a house that's obviously has a very faulty foundation, and it's falling in a somewhat humorous way. Genesis 1:14 through 16 says, "And then God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them, sun and moon, plural, be for signs and seasons." Seasons, again, Strong's 4150, which means moedim or appointments, and for days and for years. There's our foundation right there in Genesis. Answering the lunar Sabbath float objection. Next, let's consider the question of floating lunar Sabbaths, which are often misunderstood. For this exercise, we will look at a Jewish Messianic calendar from 2017. Please make a mental note of the Sabbaths in this example, falling on the 6th, the 13th, the 20th, and the 22nd. And I believe this is from the 4th month in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so let's go down here. When the anachronistic, which means out of chronological order, when the anachronistic solar-only Gregorian calendar is considered to be the original or foundation calendar of Genesis and is laid down first with the lunar-solar calendar transparency placed on top, it looks like what we see below. And here we find that on the Gregorian calendar, on this transparency that I made up, I showed the traditional Saturday Sabbath on the 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th, like we have above, and the lunar Sabbaths fall on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, which we would, in today's vernacular, call Monday. So the question is, does the lunar Sabbath float? And the answer is yes, but only on an unbiblical calendar. The lunar Sabbath artificially floats, ending up on different days each month, but it only does so when the unscriptural solar calendar is laid down first, as though it is the foundational Genesis calendar, which it is not. The only thing that ever floated in the Bible is an accent with a little smiley face. Unfortunately, the world's economies do operate on secular calendars. So lunar Sabbatarians who want to remain true to the Scriptures will have their challenges, but we do the best we can. Yah, who knows our hearts, will take care of the rest. However, when the true foundational lunar solar calendar is laid down first, as it should be, with the solar-only calendar resting on top, we discover that the so-called Saturday Sabbaths are the ones that really float. So in this illustration here, you can see that the seventh-day biblical Sabbaths of the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th are in the seventh-day position and align with the phases of the moon. But the 6th, 13th, and 20th, and 22nd from our Gregorian calendar falls on what we would call today, in today's vernacular, Thursday. So Saturday Sabbaths float on a biblical Sabbath. What we clearly see by this simple illustration is that so many so-called seventh-day Sabbaths are the ones that really float when the later Gregorian calendar is laid on top of the Genesis calendar. This is the reason that Saturday Sabbatarians don't put an F for fixed upon their Saturday Sabbaths on the chart that introduced this study. It's only an illusion that causes Saturday Sabbatarians to think that the seventh-day Sabbaths are in some way fixed, even though they keep changing dates. Saturday Sabbaths are not the seventh day of anything biblical. The lunar solar Sabbaths, on the other hand, really don't float. They're fixed on God's original lunar solar calendar, the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of each month, in accordance with the approximate phases of the moon. Have you ever heard of a so-called seventh-day Sabbath falling on the 5th day of the week, or Saturday Sabbaths falling on what we would call Thursdays today? The reason is simple. The Gregorian solar-only calendar, which all Saturday Sabbatarians use to determine their seventh-day Sabbath, is clearly unbiblical. Okay, I already covered that point. Conclusion. Though the adversary has tried to eradicate the biblical Sabbath, lunar Sabbatarians have the privilege of seeing and participating in its restoration. Below is a quick pass-fail reference chart for some of the points discussed above. And so on this chart, I've listed some things, and I've indicated in a column where it says solar-only calendar, whether it's a pass or a fail, and under the column lunar solar calendar, whether it's a pass or fail. So verses identifying Sabbaths falling on Saturday, there are no verses in Scripture that identify any Sabbaths falling on Saturday, so the solar-only calendar fails. Verses identifying the Sabbaths, however, falling on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th from Scripture, either directly or indirectly, of which there are more than 20, on a lunar solar calendar, that passes the test. Verses showing Saturday as a scriptural seventh day fail with a solar-only calendar. But verses showing the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th as the scriptural seventh day, of which there are 20, with the lunar solar calendar, pass. Saturdays are day-specific, meaning they keep changing every day of the month, so that is unscriptural, and they fail. So the solar-only calendar fails again. Lunar Sabbaths are date-specific, meaning that they are fixed 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th on the lunar solar calendar, so it passes the test. Genesis chapter 1, Saturday Sabbath template equals lunar solar 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. On a solar-only calendar, it fails. On a lunar solar calendar, it passes. 2 or 3 witnesses needed to establish a matter, as in the case of a Sabbath. Those witnesses are lacking on a solar-only calendar, so it fails. But those witnesses, both the sun and the moon being those 2 witnesses, pass on a lunar solar calendar. And Ezekiel 22:26, the mixture test, combining the solar and lunar-only solar calendars together, it fails on the solar-only calendar because they combine 2 different calendars, but it passes on the lunar solar calendar because there's only one calendar for determining both the weekly and the annual Sabbath. So anyway, that kind of concludes what I wanted to share today. And if there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
Well, thank you, Brother Dan. That was a very interesting study, and I hope you were all able to see the chart. If you weren't, we'll be sending the recording link out so that you can study it. And for those of you listening to the recording, to contact Brother Dan, you can send your request to me at lunarsabbathday@yahoo.com, and I'll forward your email to Brother Dan. And we're going to close the recording, and then we're going to open up discussion time.